All right, thank you all for joining us for the second lecture in the virtual lecture and workshop series, Bio and Psyche, Reading the Symptomatic Body. My name is Els Boutstra, and together with Brooke Clark, I'm the organizer of this symposium series, which was originally planned as an in-person symposium to be held in May 2020, which for obvious reasons did not happen. So I'd like to take this moment to thank the Rice University Humanities Research Center for letting us hold on to our funding and for supporting our transition to this virtual format. We're thrilled to see all of you here today. So please make yourselves comfortable, mute your microphones. I will as well, so my dog doesn't bark through this, what looks like it's going to be a very exciting lecture. This lecture has live captions. If there are any other accessibility support you need during the lecture, please flag me or flag Brooke and we'll help you out. And then after Professor Lane's lecture, you'll have the opportunity to talk to your fellow participants for a little bit in breakout rooms. Since it's much harder to bump into one another in these virtual events, we hope that these breakout sessions will allow you to mingle and meet some other people at this lecture. And to share your thoughts and questions on the lecture with them before we go into the Q&A. Also during the lecture, please feel free to use the chat to speak among yourselves, but we recommend you save your questions for the Q&A. So in total, the lecture and the Q&A will take approximately an hour and 15 minutes. We're recording this as well, and it will be uploaded eventually to our website, hrc.rice.edu/biopsyche. In the chat, you'll be able to find links and descriptions to the rest of the lectures in this series, which will happen on Friday, May 21st and Friday, May 28th, a lecture by Venus Guinez and a lecture by Travis Lau. And now I give the word to Judith Ruth, who will introduce Professor Lane to all of us.
Thank you, Els. It's my pleasure to introduce Christopher Lane, Professor of English at Northwestern University, where he's also a member of the Center for Bioethics and Medical Humanities. Professor Lane is the author of 6 books, including The Burdens of Intimacy, Shyness, How Normal Behavior Became a Sickness, and Surge of Piety, Norman Vincent Peale and the Remaking of American Religious Life. His work has appeared in a wide range of journals, from Victorian Studies, his original field, to ELH, Modernism, Modernity, PMLA, Theory and Psychology, Common Knowledge, the International Journal of Psychoanalysis, and the International Literary Quarterly, as well as in such other venues as the New York Times, Washington Post, Boston Globe, Time Magazine, Los Angeles Times, Chicago Sun-Times, Huffington Post, and the Daily Beast. He's been a Guggenheim Fellow and is the recipient of the Prescrier Prize for Medical Writing. And I was lucky enough to meet him a long, long time ago. His presentation today is titled On the Entanglements of Bio and Psyche, Past and Present. So Professor Lane.
Judith, thank you so much for that very kind introduction, and to Els and Brooke for setting this up so beautifully. I'm grateful also to Melissa at the Humanities Research Center for hosting. My aim today is to try to shed more light on the vexed entanglements of bio and psyche for our bodies and desires, including to remind us of a path we might have taken more than a century ago, and indeed could still take. For complex reasons, including how we translate terms and concepts into English, that path wasn't visible to researchers and clinicians at the time, and I think remains obscured today by well-meant but oversimplifying gestures, such as the drive to speak of biopsychosocial factors, even as the biological, for at least the past half century, always takes precedence, or orients the whole and how we approach it, and far from insignificant, takes the lion's share of research funding from influential bodies like the National Institute of Mental Health. The latter named an entire decade for the brain, the 1990s, and continues to throw billions of dollars at efforts to identify predictive biomarkers for our behavior in what seems likely to remain a costly and politically worrying failure. Costly and worrying also for its impoverished conception of mind and consciousness, more on which soon. I'm going to talk today for about 40 minutes, and then we can open it up for discussion. There are 3 sections to my talk. I'm just going to share my screen with you now. Oops. And go into mode here. Good. And the first of these is called the Freud Wars. So let's set the dial of our time machine, if we can, back to 1897 and try to revisit a year a major fork in the road appeared. 1897 was, you may recall, the year the neurologist Sigmund Freud set out with a few chemical aids to undertake an auto-analysis, with essays such as Screen Memories, identifying what today we would call the photoshopping effect of memories revisited years later and experienced as though empirically authentic. At the time, Freud concluded that it would be better to speak of childhood memories as being formed retroactively through temporal delay and associated triggers. Quote, "It may indeed be questioned whether we have any memories at all from our childhood," he writes. "Memories relating to our childhood may be all that we possess." Those were his emphases. After focusing on overvivid personal memories of a bright yellow dress and the taste of some delicious bread, in a kind of reminiscence rivaling Proust and his Madeleines, Freud asserts quite reasonably, our childhood memories show us our earliest years not as they were, but as they appeared at the later periods when the memories were aroused. And here's the kicker. A number of motives with no concern for historical accuracy had a part in forming them, as well as in the selection of the memories themselves, close quote. For post-Freudian diehards such as Jeffrey Masson and Frederick Crews in the 1980s and 90s, and this sort of dates me a little, but that's fine, each curiously enamored by these arguments earlier in their careers before they did a 180 and broadly trashed them. The sentences were taken as a scandalous betrayal of empirical knowledge and trust, even as unspoken complicity with the appalling frequency of sexual abuse in late Victorian culture. In hindsight, the so-called memory wars appear now as an earlier chapter of our current culture wars. A cancelled centennial exhibition on Freud at the time at the Library of Congress quickly became a symbol of all that henceforth must be thought impossible about psychoanalysis. Better, the critics argued, to dismiss it altogether, and of course many did. Now, Freud's complicating moves were never limited to memory and its complex role in recording and storing childhood events that most definitely could include sexual and non-sexual abuse. Between 1897 and 1915, when most of his papers on metapsychology were published, he also radically denatured prior conceptions of biological instincts and supposedly congenital or anomalous object choice in humans. Language inherited directly from 19th century sexologists and other contemporaries such as Havelock Ellis and Richard von Krafft-Ebing, Wilhelm Fries and Albert Moll, Charcot and Moreau de Tours, with all associated baggage about degeneracy and anomaly, abnormality and psychopathology, weighed down by the scientific racism also circulating widely at the time. Bizarre to add, but with scarcely a hint of controversy in some quarters, some of that is now back with a vengeance. With the biomarker crowd weirdly re-enamored by Cesare Lombroso's obsession with jug ears, prominent cheekbones, and over-sharp jawlines, as an apparent basis for thinking about, even trying to predict, white-collar crime today. This is a very recent piece, 2018. We might do well to remember that it was the National Socialists who popularized the same tropes in the 1920s and 30s as a rationale for criminalizing poverty and religious and sexual difference, ultimately as a dehumanizing move that enabled mass slaughter. In his excellent book, Nobody's Normal, How Culture Created the Stigma of Mental Illness, Roy Grinker, a medical anthropologist, calls the 19th century obsession with anomaly and abnormality a blunt cudgel to establish norms where they previously did not exist. He echoes both Foucault and the American anthropologist Ruth Benedict, who argued astutely and presciently in the 1930s, when the intervention was truly a life or death matter, quote, "The concept of the normal is properly a variant of the good, the concept of the good. It is that which society has approved." That process of approval and disapproval was often tied to moral judgments and other 19th century ways of thinking about disease and illness, suffering and cure. Grinker pulls no punches in attributing much of the drive to normalization and its associated falsehoods to European and American psychiatry. This is him, quote, "In fact, homosexuality was one of the key psychological conditions that helped psychiatry remain a method to regulate behavior. By turning homosexuality into a mental illness in the first half of the 20th century and the latter half of the 19th, psychologists and psychiatrists would highlight the dangers of sex and sexuality as a watchtower in the center of a prison yard illuminates everything around it," close quote. A method to regulate behavior. In this respect, the norms created were often moral ideals presented as neutral, universal, harmless, and inevitable, when they were in fact culturally inflected, contingent, and highly tendentious, often at great personal and social cost. Especially after his death in 1939, Freud was presented by American psychiatrists and medical schools as reinforcing these norms, actually almost even as responsible for them, an idea the nation's culture and media were quick to endorse. In fact, though, his break with 19th century psychiatry and its drive to normalize through psychopathology dates exactly to 1897, precisely the year Masson and others accused him of a treacherous rebuke to empiricism, and it was markedly extended in his 3 essays on the theory of sexuality from 1905, where he introduced the term trieb, and with it major conceptual distinctions among the source, pressure, and aim of the drives. That is how we translate trieb as drive. Notably and regrettably, the British psychoanalyst and translator James Strachey, brother to Lytton Strachey, in turn Virginia Woolf's close friend, opted to translate trieben as instincts, not drives, throughout the standard edition of Freud's works, thereby sedimenting a confusion across the Anglophone world in psychology and psychiatry that remains with us today. So I'm going to get into the weeds here with Freud's 3 essays, but hopefully it will be useful. Anyone who has read Freud's 3 essays likely will recall that it opens with a detailed account of the so-called, quote, sexual aberrations, among which Freud wonders whether he should include lingering and overlong kisses. Here he is obviously consistent with his peers. Far from coincidental, but less often noted, the same section performs a kind of spectacular self-deconstruction by shifting awkwardly from periphery to norm, quickly to determine that the norm itself is conceptually doubtful and insecure, even thoroughly riddled by what it seeks to exclude to attain self-definition. There's much else to the 3 essays that we pass over too rapidly today. Among other factors, as noted in the language of psychoanalysis, and sorry for the photo, this is a screenshot from an electronic version, they do get better, by Laplanche and Pontalis, Freud resolutely, quote, contests the so-called popular view that assigns to the sexual instinct a sexual aim, a specific aim and object, and instead localizes the sexual drive in the object as variable, contingent, and only chosen in its definitive form in consequence of the vicissitudes of the subject's history. I want to underline that, in consequence of the vicissitudes of the subject's history. In Freud's now famous phrase, translation modified, let me see if I've got this here. Yep, the sexual drive and the sexual object are merely soldered together. We're thus warned to loosen the bond that exists in our thoughts between drive and object. it seems probable that the drive is in the first instance independent of its object, nor is its origin likely to be due to the object's attractions, close quote. Last part, a little cryptic. The mere soldering of the object to the drive's aim fixes for the duration of the attachment, its relationship, and its underlying fantasy, a bond that is highly contingent without an underlying biological foundation or rationale. Logically, not here culturally, extending into adult life, the polymorphous state that Freud describes as characteristic of childhood. As Arnold Davidson extrapolated in Critical Inquiry, in a brilliant essay on Freud's break with 19th century psychiatry, by claiming in effect that there is no natural object to the sexual drive, that the sexual object and sexual instinct or drive are merely soldered together, Freud dealt a conceptually devastating blow to the entire structure of 19th century theories of psychopathology. Indeed, he did. A century later, we still not only fail to grasp the implications of that remarkable rupture, but have, if anything, folded Freud back into the Victorian edifice from which he had more or less broken conclusively by the 1910s, thereby all but guaranteeing that we continue to misperceive a way out. Put another way, we continue to be subject to an intensely Victorian style of thought. Over the contingency among sexual object, aim, and drive, as we might expect, hangs a near perpetual threat of failure, a break in the soldering fantasy transference structure, as anyone who has tried to solder wire to a circuit board will recognize. But the pressure and contingency are also culturally and historically inflected, as by our own unique, entirely singular incorporation and interpretation of experiences, generating insights about the late Victorian obsession with supposedly congenital object choice at the time, when any contingency appeared distinctly unwelcome, indeed punishable by some laws. And let's remember that more than 1,000 books on male homosexuality alone were published in Europe between 1896 and 1906, just a single decade. In a footnote added to the first of his 3 essays in 1910, Freud comments, the most striking distinction, quote, between erotic life and antiquity and our own, no doubt lies in the fact that the ancients laid stress upon the drive itself, whereas we emphasize its object. The ancients glorified the drive while we despise the drive's activity in itself. He's obviously talking about Victorian disgust. Though stark, the distinction between antiquity and modernity is broadly sound and itself weirdly under-recognized, eliciting little commentary across the decades since. Whereas classical Greek literature expounds at length on the different modalities of the drive, from eros, agape, and philia to storge, as attachments respectively sexual, devotional, friendly, non-sexual, and parental/nurturing, the late Victorian obsession with sexual object choice as the apparent truth of personhood, as Foucault was quick to critique, also masks, Freud insisted at the time, widespread historically inflected contempt for the drive's activity in itself, made tolerable apparently only by idealizing or blaming the object and attempting to obscure/forget the drives that attach to it. Behind such structural necessities for the time, it isn't difficult to find a continuum involving not just anguish, but disgust over sex, frequently displaced onto women as its apparent cause, eliciting in the fiction not just threat and panic, but often full-fledged violence. I refer to mid-century figures such as the, quote, fallen woman, often subject to abuse and violence, the culture, as well as the brutal killing in, say, Stevenson's Strange Case of Sir Danvers Carew, a, quote, aged and beautiful gentleman, close quote, who is inexplicably beaten to a pulp by a figure said to be, quote, boiling with causeless hatreds, while the doctor himself, as Hyde, under the influence of a transforming powder bearing a striking resemblance to cocaine, is said to be propelled by, quote, demonic urges he can neither accept nor properly understand. quote, if there is no natural object, sorry, let me get this, to the sexual instinct, Davidson extrapolates from Freud on the complex bridge that takes us from biology to culture, then, quote, deviations from the aim of genital intercourse appear to lose their status as genuine perversions, as pathological aberrations whose status outstrips any supposed statistical abnormality, close quote. Put another way, as he does, quote, the idea that the sexual drive is made up of components, that it so combines a multiplicity of zones and aims, is a further radical break with the 19th century medical conceptualization of the sexual instinct, in that neither the erotogenic zone of the genitals nor the aim of copulation bear any privileged connection to the sexual instinct. Close quote. That's worth underscoring. As Freud himself put it in a 1915 footnote to the 3 essays, should have that here, and I'm going to cut this, it's too much text. Psychoanalytic research has found that all human beings are capable of making a same-sex object choice and have in fact made one in their unconscious. Thus, from the point of view of psychoanalysis, the exclusive sexual interest felt by men for women is also a problem that needs elucidating and is not a self-evident fact, close quote. I want to dwell a fraction longer on the implications of this break with biological conceptions of object choice and their contingent, non-inevitable relation to psychical drives that underpin them. I think there's much to be said about this. As Freud would later write of the object in an essay Lacan would translate as drives and their adventures, the object is, quote, what is most variable about a drive and is not originally connected with it, but becomes assigned to it only in consequence of it being peculiarly fitted to make satisfaction possible. The object also need not be something extraneous, Laplanche and Pontalis remind, but may equally be part of the subject's own body. If now we apply ourselves to considering mental life from a biological point of view, Freud encourages in that 1915 essay, obviously best known to us in English as Instincts and Their Vicissitudes, quote, a drive appears to us as a concept on the frontier between the mental and the somatic, as the psychical representative of the stimuli originating from within the organism and reaching the mind as a measure of the demand made upon the mind for work in consequence of its connection with the body. It's a complex sentence, but really what I'm focusing on there is the idea of a frontier between the mental and the somatic being bridged by a psychical representative. Later in The Ego and the Id, he even calls it a frontier creature to help us visualize a kind of amoeba-like blob soldered over a major gap between drive and object, and I guess clinging to both ends like mad to keep it all in place. Since it can help to visualize this break and its varied implications, let me introduce you now to the diagramming I created for Freud's 1908 essay on, quote, civilized sexual morality and the modern nervous illness. Those are Freud's quotes around civilized, which I modeled for Northwestern students on Chicago's LMAP so that they could make it back to Evanston okay. Here we go. There's the original and here's my copy. Yeah, you can see it's leaves something to be desired. But anyway, if you're heading north, I don't know if you can see my cursor, from Fullerton and say DePaul University, it's effectively at Belmont here that one reaches an enabling structurating knot where in passing across the platform, but also in psychoanalysis entering into language, symbolization, the red line here designating culture, proceeding up here, continues alongside the biological, here the purple line, express, which shadows it and provides its fundamentals in terms of bridges and infrastructure, but also has just one stop where they meet, which is now Wilson. The red line, however, has all kinds of stations for possible exits, including another key interchange at Howard Street, which is here on my map, With several more destinations available, you can head off to Skokie or head to Evanston this way as well. The idea of destination here is tied to the singularity of each journey and of the person taking it, with the psychical configuration of their desires very much in mind. There are pre-established pathways in that respect, but no fixed route beyond the specific pressures and aims of the drives themselves, tied to our experiences, remembered and anticipated pleasures, and importantly here, to avoid any suggestion of voluntarism, they're unconscious coordinates, which can't be altered at will because formed in our maturation from childhood. This is my final section. It's called the New Phrenology. So truly radical in making the drives and thus the body a kind of bridge between biology and culture, the implications of Freud's thought ought to have been world-changing. For complex reasons, including because of the memory wars and more broadly the Freud wars, the shift itself was never fully perceived or realized. Folded back into current debates about essentialism and constructivism, the Freudian model complicates both while resetting discussion about causality and change, which is another way of talking about development and freedom. Put another way, via Freud's theory of the drive, the answer to nature versus nurture is always both and not either or. We can point to relatively new subfields such as epigenetics and social genomics to determine that yes, it is a both and that the social and environmental can in fact influence the genetic and genomic. Think of neuroplasticity, for example, in ways that can become critical transgenerational determinants of health, well-being, and educational attainment. But the early structuring of polymorphous desire and the role of mind and consciousness is at the same time almost entirely missing from neuroscientific emphases, which tend to bypass them more or less in one leap from genes to brain functions and cognitions. Here is Stanford neurologist and best-selling author Robert Sapolsky in his opening chapter to Behave, The Biology of Humans at Our Best and Worst from 2017, indicating the problem for him at the outset. A behavior has occurred, one that is reprehensible or wonderful or floating ambiguously in between. What occurred in the prior second that triggered that behavior? This is the province of the nervous system. What occurred in the prior seconds to minutes that triggered the nervous system to produce that behavior? This is the world of sensory stimuli, much of it sensed unconsciously. What occurred in the prior hours to days to change the sensitivity of the nervous system to such stimuli? Acute actions of hormones, and so on, all the way back to the evolutionary pressures played out over the prior millions of years that started the ball rolling. Close quote. So note that the sensing of sensory stimuli, is recorded here via passive voice, eclipsing any mental faculty or agency. Sapolsky isn't a full-fledged determinist, but he has only limited space for free will, technically making him a compatibilist, in that he recognizes the capacity of the brain to override such genetic dispositions, but he's similarly quick to convert social and psychical behaviors into their supposed biological underpinnings, insisting, for instance, that there's a biology to complex, historically relatively recent behaviors such as altruism, reconciliation, and empathy, in ways that downgrade or degrade mind and consciousness to mere agents overseeing the influence of hormones and the like. I mean, for example, the Victorians had to coin the signifier altruism in the 1850s because they lacked a comparable term, and they took it from the Italian autrui, to or for the other, and the French autre, the other. But it was a coinage that didn't previously exist in English, and it was owing to cultural pressures, not biological ones. In this respect, however, much of the new neuroscience is also a new phrenology. Whoops, here. The quack science from the late 18th century that insisted on apportioning historically specific behaviors such as amativeness, out here right at the bottom, and veneration right at the top, or meant to be, to their allegedly corresponding regions of the brain. Sapolsky is, of course, far from alone in making this move. I've got one more, sorry for phrenology. This is, you can see a kind of, well, it's not a joke, but it ought to be. The reason this man is an unreliable husband, you can see from the cranial structure here, it's because he's very weak in conjugality and parental love, and exceedingly strong in amativeness here. Young ladies, beware of such men as husbands. Young ladies, here, for the genuine husband, indelibly fix the shape of head in your minds. Let me just press on. That was my, yep. Sapolsky is, of course, far from alone in making this move. In their 2013 book, Neuro, The New Brain Sciences and the Management of the Mind, historians of psychiatry Nicholas Rose and Joel Abi-Rashed assessed the myriad social and political consequences of dividing consciousness between such false and troubling oppositions as the, quote, social brain and the antisocial brain, which in turn influence everything from psychiatry to the criminal justice system. Let us consider just the first of these, psychiatry, and the supposed biology of mental disorders, because of its major implications for psychopharmacology and the medicalization of ordinary behaviors and states, including suffering and distress. The notion that mental disorders are genetically encoded brain disorders is everywhere around us, note several prominent researchers in a recent issue of Behavioral and Brain Sciences. I've written about here for Psychology Today. In an article, they gave the insouciant and very Dutch title, Brain Disorders, Not Really. The notion otherwise holds such currency, they write, that it, quote, dominates the organization of research, dominates teaching, and it dominates the media, close quote. Instead of being reducible to a biological emphasis, Denny Bosboom and colleagues at 3 leading universities in the Netherlands conclude, quote, mental disorders feature biological and psychological factors that are deeply intertwined in feedback loops. This suggests, they say, that neither psychological nor biological levels can claim causal or explanatory priority, close quote. Commenting in the same forum, the prominent Stanford scientist John Ioannidis observed, quote, if mental health problems are mostly not brain disorders, the dearth of useful neuroscience-derived biomarkers is only to be expected. There is enormous investment in basic neuroscience research and intensive searches for informative biomarkers of treatment response and toxicity, he added, yet the yield is close to nil, close quote. To overcome this dead end, he advised we should shift emphasis away from the research paradigm that considers mental health problems to be mostly brain disorders and move towards exploring other potentially more fruitful paths, such as environmental factors, themselves, of course, impacting genes. He clearly had front and center the now infamous example and apologia of Thomas Insel, former director of the NIMH, from the so-called decade of the brain in the 1990s, who finally issued this mea culpa in 2017, just as he leapt from the agency to a Silicon Valley startup. Quote, I spent 13 years at the National Institute for Mental Health, really pushing on the neuroscience and genetics of mental disorders. And when I look back on that, I realized that while I think I succeeded at getting lots of really cool papers published by cool scientists at fairly large costs, I think $20 billion, I don't think we moved the needle in reducing suicide, reducing hospitalizations, improving recovery for the tens of millions of people who have mental illness. I hold myself accountable for that. Let me just restate, I don't think we move the needle. I hold myself accountable for that. Well, not accountable enough, according to Jonathan Shedler, psychology professor at UC Berkeley, who wrote on Twitter, genuine accountability would mean revising assumptions and doing things differently. And Insel's decision to join a Google-funded startup made clear that he wasn't switching tracks at all. You really can distinguish psych causes from brain causes without being a dualist, reminds University of Pittsburgh philosopher and bioethicist Diane O'Leary. Most colleagues, students in philosophy of mind, she claims, now accept a distinction between experiential states and brain states, even as they recognize that one arises from the other. Note her caution here about determining which is causal. The late Scott Lilienfeld also was admirably precise on the risks of confusing biological etiology or causality here with biological mediation or interinvolvement and intertwining, to echo Borsbroom and his Dutch colleagues, and the ongoing urgent need to pay attention to their difference. Quote, investigators must be careful, he warned, not to confuse biological mediation with biological etiology. This tempting semantic slippage is subtle but substantial in implications. For example, in principle, a psychological condition could be triggered largely by psychosocial factors, such as childhood sexual or physical abuse. Although this condition would, of course, be mediated by brain circuitry, its etiology would be primarily environmental, close quote. What seems like a solution then, in coinage invoking the biopsychosocial, is precisely the complex relation among these three terms, including their presumptive ordering with bio as the first cause or mover. Biopsychosocial is a misnomer and misleading. UK medical researcher James Barnes cautioned recently. The psycho and social are usually considered only as stressors or triggers of biological processes. The meaning, the content is for them irrelevant. What is meant, he writes, is bio, in caps, psychosocial, and the rest in, so psychosocial in parens. One more here, one more example. A nasty side effect of the hyperbiomedicalization of mental illness and addictive disorders, Rick Barnett observed also on Med and Psych Twitter, is the outright diminution of the most major aspects of mental illness and addictive disorders, that is to say, mind, heart, and humanism, close quote. So as we wrestle with attempts to formulate biopsychosocial approaches to everything from desire to distress and disorder, with evolutionary psychology standing firm on our supposedly immutable instincts, as Robert Sapolsky made clear, it's necessary to ask what Freud's occluded theory from a century ago could still bring to our understanding of sexuality, object choice, and determinism, but also strongly related to such key matters as psychical emancipation and freedom, including freedom from the biological, and maybe just as related, the freedom to not repeat. And here I quote Freud himself from The Future of an Illusion, in case his contempt for such positions wasn't fully appreciated. Quote, a civilization which leaves so large a number of its participants unsatisfied and drives them into revolt neither has nor deserves the prospect of a lasting existence, close quote. There's a risk, Laplanche and Pontalis assess in the language of psychoanalysis, that the Freudian theory of the instincts may be confused with psychological conceptions of animal instincts, and the unique aspects of Freud's approach may be blurred, particularly the thesis of the relatively underdetermined nature of the motive force in question, and the notions of contingency of object and variability of aim, close quote. For Arnold Davidson at the University of Chicago, by contrast, quote, Freud's genius consisted not simply in appropriating that contingency, but in seizing and exploiting it. He provided, Davidson argues, a conceptual foundation for the newly emerging mentality that made it possible once and for all for us to change decisively our old mental habits, close quote. Indeed, and I strongly agree with this. It's important to underscore, however, that the legacy bestowed isn't voluntaristic, isn't, for instance, something we can think or will ourselves into by fiat, as enjoined by perspectives such as positive psychology and endless upbeat affirmations. Perhaps initially we wrestle instead with the freedom that opens up, all the choices available, all the decisions that await. If Freudian psychoanalysis properly gives us freedom from biological instincts, and I think it does, and I've tried to argue that it does, including the freedom to not repeat them, it shifts the burden to existential responsibility, which of course is onerous, but also can include the exhilaration of fully conscious, intentional direction, a pathway guided as much by self-insight and understanding as we can muster. In terms of the psychical map resembling the Chicago L and the various lines and stations presenting an exit to us, a lot may depend, I'm concluding, on whom we meet at Howard Street or at Belmont, or on the red line making all stops in between. Thank you. We'll stop my screen share here and we can go back to discussion.
Thank you so much, Professor Lane. I see we have a couple of people, unfortunately, have had to leave. So we can make relatively large breakout groups, or we can just stay here. Our one big breakout group at the moment, whichever we would prefer.
Why don't we stay as a group like this?
Let's stick around, yeah.
If people would like to, or.
Are we asking questions now?
Yeah, we can go straight into the questions, as a bunch of people have had to leave, and the breakout rooms will be very, very small. So Judith.
So we have a question from Marianne. Marianne?
Hi, yeah, it's Miriam with an M.
Miriam.
That's okay. I had two questions. One of them, I'm sorry, it might be just like the dumb obvious question, but I loved your talk and I just really want to know what you think, like what your answer is to the dumb obvious question. But what is the role in the end for you, like how you see it, of psychopharmaceutical drugs, like as something, especially I think in relation to in these specific disorders that through, the evidence-based medical model and randomized controlled drugs have been deemed to be not treatable by things like psychotherapy alone. So I'm talking about bipolar disorder and schizophrenia. Like, what does this mean? What do we do? So that's kind of a huge question. I guess, yeah, I'll just leave it there.
Oh, it's a great question. And thank you for asking it. So I think in the field of psychopharmacology, there is sort of endless slippage between the apparent biological effects of the drugs and the wish that they have some kind of psychosocial consequence, which would be the lifting of depression or the reduction of anxiety and so on. And I think a lot of the marketing has attempted a kind of continual slippage from one to the other. But and in order for that to be possible, we've had narratives and frankly myths or falsehoods, like the chemical imbalance myth of depression, implying that, for instance, low levels of serotonin will determine depression, and that the SSRI drugs are supposed to counter that by ensuring that more serotonin is available to the brain. We have, from endless research, including evidence-based research, determined that that is false, that the relations of serotonin to depression are extremely complicated and not predictive of an improvement in either depression or anxiety. but the narrative continues regardless. And so I think, I mean, one of the things I was trying to do today, Miriam, and thank you for that, was sort of really talk about how the narrative can live on even when the evidence itself isn't supporting it. A narrative about Freud, for example, as invalid or as maybe useful for a particular moment, but having very little to say for us today. And it is sort of broadly similar, but on the flip side with psychopharmacology, that the biological and the psychical are not in tandem there. There is maybe an assumption or consensus, a limited consensus among biological psychiatrists that bipolar and schizophrenia are only treatable by atypicals, atypical antipsychotics. But again, those are, the relationship between the biological and the psychical in that case are highly fraught in that there are all kinds of biological consequences and adverse effects of the atypicals, as there are with all antipsychotics, including increased diabetes, weight gain, a huge number of other adverse effects that aren't in tandem with predictive improvements among symptoms, a reduction in symptoms. Instead, patients just are dealing with a whole slew of broadly biological related consequences to these drugs. So I am, count me highly skeptical of them and of the narrative that supports them. I always am willing to say that there are extreme cases to be tested, cases where non-medical treatments are ineffective or have failed. But I would just say, Lacan, for example, was emphatic that schizophrenia could be treated non-pharmaceutically, as could other conditions that we now have been told, basically through billions of dollars in marketing, can only be treated by these drugs. They don't lead to good long-term outcomes. They lead to huge problems with withdrawal, in terms of people trying to quit them, come off them safely, tapering sometimes over years and not just weeks and months. And so it's a long answer, but it's to say, I think there are real consequences to the denigration of psychical adjustments, to the idea of not just psychoanalysis, but psychotherapy, making possible a shift in perspective, including an examination of what may be psychical causes for depression and anxiety. Thanks for a great question.
So
Thank you.
We have Kara Kilgallen, and then we have two in the chat line, one from Charles Parakis and one from Patricia Hart-Maxwell. If we can go in that order, Kara.
Thank you, Christopher, so much for such an enlightening talk. And I'm so grateful that you're creating a space for discourse on Freud, because as an Americanist and an English professor, I find that it's very, very difficult to discuss Freud sometimes in literary circles, but on the flip side, also in sort of cognitive psychology circles as well. My question does have to do with the future of an illusion. I actually teach at a Catholic institution that's no denomination, very influenced by the Jesuits, very focused on social justice. And one of the texts that is taught in one of the core courses is The Future of an Illusion. So I guess I'm sort of curious about Freud's perspective on religion and sort of the degree to which the essay articulates religion as a healthy impulse or not, or if it's not that simple.
Excellent question. Thank you for that. I write about Freud's essay, The Future of an Illusion, and his correspondence with a Swiss pastor in the book on Norman Vincent Peale, because it's highly relevant. I mean, a kind of little sidebar, Norman Vincent Peale and his psychiatrist collaborator, a man called Smiley Blanton, literally first name Smiley, from Tennessee, Blanton went to Vienna to undertake an analysis with Freud right at the time that it was becoming very dangerous to do so. And Freud was in the course, I mean, it went over several summers. By the end of it, Freud had relocated, had fled under persecution to London. And it's from that very strange interact. I mean, Blanton wrote a book about it called Memoirs of My Analysis with Sigmund Freud. It wasn't really an analysis, it was more a series of questions about religion and especially religious transference. That was their fixation. He then shared all of that with Vincent Peale, who then, between them, they set up what became the, quote, religio-psychiatric clinic at the Church, 28th Street and Fifth Avenue, Manhattan, and then it burgeoned from that into the American Foundation of Psychiatry and Religion. And the fascinating thing, Cara, is that they relied intensely on Freud's theory of religious transference to say basically there could be a sort of mass movement toward religiosity based on this propensity to think of the deity as structurally in a place similar to the analyst, in a weird way, as sort of the subject supposed to know. And a lot of the 1950s religiosity, I claim in that book, is sort of owing to Freud's theory and Freud's theory of transference, which would have appalled him. And I think in the course of the interviewing, he realized that he was being set up a little bit. There, you might remember there are all of those comments right at the end of Future of an Illusion about American religiosity and what it has been used for. And I think it is, although it's an earlier work, I think it is connected to that. So I think it's complex because it's a very fascinating work, and what people have taken from it is only this sense that he was skeptical of religious belief. Whereas in the correspondence with Oskar Pfister, is the Swiss pastor, there's a whole book that Pfister wrote about it. He's actually far more in the pastoral mode of thinking of religious faith as having protective consequences for people that may be advantageous when they're grieving, when they are. For instance, there aren't forms of solace immediately available in a secular structure. So I think it's hard to read that as only his position on religion.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you. Thanks for the great question.
Charles Parakis, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, I'll ask my question. Thank you for the presentation. I come from a less academic setting as a retired family doctor, but I appreciate what you do. I just, in the previous talk and in this talk, I see very little mention of the spiritual, which in medicine has become a very strong driving force of positivity as far as I'm concerned. And lately, the connection to nature that we are discovering, civilization has driven us from that connection, which is primal and had a great deal to do with our behavior. And we see wondrous things when people go to places or things of awe. Well, could you comment on that? Are we all missing the boat with psychoanalysis?
Well, it's a fascinating question and a big one. I am personally agnostic or atheistic on this, but I nonetheless perceive a real space for the spiritual as something maybe beyond the human. I think one can conceptualize it in all different ways. That psychologically, psychoanalytically can be invaluable in removing us from just the simple dramas, for instance, of the interpersonal. That sometimes the intervention of a factor, the extra human, the beyond human, the non-human can mediate and can open up a space for a different perspective, a different way of thinking, for which I am completely supportive. And so I don't see my role as in any way there to prescribe people's relationship to their spirituality. I broadly support it, and at the same time, I think one can and maybe ought to differentiate between that and sort of the consequences of organized religion. In that, as Cara was maybe hinting at in the previous question, that there are consequences to mass movements of religiosity. It's been written about a fair amount in the famous study, the True Believer, and the risk of extremism. I think spirituality does not carry that same risk, and that it can be really productive in complicating our assumptions about a secular world and about the human as a sufficient scale for either justice or a kind of solution to internecine problems within society. So I see it as very helpful, productive.
Are you familiar with George Rodek and The Wild?
I am not, but I will pursue that. But thank you very much for the question.
Patricia Hart Maxwell, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, I'm sorry if I'm a bit muffled. I have an animal in front of my microphone. So I'm a master's student at Trent University in the public text program. And something that we work on is distinguishing between the public and private. And just with your comments about freedom from biology and repeating these kinds of things reminded me a lot of Arendt's writing from the ancient Greco-Roman period. So I was just wondering if you recognize any problems in separating people from their biology, especially in the sense that the public was thought of as freedom from biology, but was only open to male citizens. So just that kind of idea of who has freedom from biology, and also with so much work that has been done to finally get us to a point of re-accepting our bodies as important parts of ourselves.
That's a great question, and I'm really glad you asked it, because yeah, I do not want to be construed as sort of eclipsing the body, or sort of presenting a kind of voluntaristic falsehood around the biological either. I mean, listen, I mean, in terms of the both and issues in the talk, in terms of nurture and nature, and with my insistence on psychoanalysis not being a voluntarism, it is possibly only in very limited ways that we can speak about this freedom from biology. I mean, it is above all, I think, freedom from determinism, which I think of in a more at a bigger scale, in the sense of the freedom to not repeat, the freedom to break with the past, the freedom to perceive errors and to correct them without living as if one is sort of at the mercy of hormone levels, for example, or genetic determinism, which I think can be one of the big risks in a strongly neuroscientific emphasis. So the degrading of consciousness worries me, but I don't want to, I'm hedging, but I don't want to be perceived as if I am just trashing biology or saying that it's no space for it. I think the whole analogy with the purple line sort of shadowing the red line, if you like, if you go back to the L system in Chicago, is that it is always there and it is an underpinning, but it also doesn't determine always the the direction of the journey. And I think that's where I want to bring back Davidson in the sense of the freedom to not repeat, the freedom to do things differently. But you're absolutely right that normally the conception of a freedom from biology is a privilege given to an elite, and there are consequences to it. It's not being sort of available to all, and that worries me too. And I think you're absolutely right to pinpoint that historically as a risk and as a worry, and also that it could lead, or it could be perceived as leading to a voluntarism, that we can just sort of reinvent ourselves. We are magically free of these issues and therefore unencumbered by them. And I don't think that's correct either. I'm trying to reproportion their deterministic power here.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
So Els and then Emily Bryant.
Yes, thank you. I think actually my question kind of continues where Patricia started. I was really happy that you mentioned the sensory stimuli question in your talk, and I've been thinking about this whole role of sensory processing in Freud's theory of the unconscious, and in relation to specifically to neurodiversity, because neurodiversity, as like ADHD or autism or related conditions, has and is increasingly described as a thing of brain wiring, as like as a neurological condition. But it's also something that I was just Googling. Apparently about 20% of the population is neurodiverse. And thinking of this, especially in relation to Freud's idea of the unconscious as this layer of onions that kind of forms as a shell against the stimuli from the outside, as, you know, the stuff that comes in because it's just too intense, like the layers of skin that kind of die off so touch isn't so painful, and the eyes that are the only visual organs that are relatively small and protected. I was basically wondering about your thoughts on or the reading of psychoanalysis of neurodiversity, specifically in relation to the sensory processing, because that also is such a common thread in these neurodiverse conditions, having sensory processing issues. Yes.
Thank you for that. What a great question too, and it does extend that discussion. So I think there's no problem or incompatibility between accepting neurodiversity and understanding that psychoanalysis can talk about mental processing in ways that may be influenced by it. I don't see a problem there. I do think of the causality as complicated, but in one sense, the focus on neurodiversity is consistent, for example, with the book Nobody's Normal, just simply extended into the biological realm as well. That the idea that there is one kind of normal, optimal biological functioning is itself highly prescriptive and worrying, in that it gets used to determine all kinds of, for example, optimal hormonal levels for women and for men. I think at the Low T campaign for men with low testosterone, for example, that's kind of the would be the male equivalent to the estrogen campaigns and the to do with menopause. So I don't see it as incompatible. I think one can extend the two and in in broad sort of dialogue with each other without there being mutually exclusive. So I think one of the focuses on Grinke's book is that the imperatives around the norms are also influencing biological prescription as well, biological understanding, and that they are themselves tied to ideals of that then can be highly punitive. So I welcome neurodiversity and as a perspective in that it also is complicating the assumption of a straightforward biological norm, which after all gets highly racist in the sense of the norm as always taken as Caucasian, and it doesn't factor in profound differences biologically also in terms of different ways of different effects of hormone treatment and so on. So if it's about expanding that norm to the point where it no longer appears as one, I think in biological terms that also has to be welcomed, but definitely it complicates healthcare. It doesn't give us a single standard. Most of those biological norms are also from the 50s too, by the way, with the kind of this sort of structuring knot around DSM-1 and the post-war kind of reconstellation of a norm out of profound cultural and political anxiety.
Emily Bryant.
Yes, thanks, Chris, so much for this talk. I am so enchanted with the map and who you meet along the way. And I was thinking about your talk, and I was thinking that there's really this increasing almost division, I think, in the country, and I don't think it falls on political lines necessarily, but more and more we are relying on data, and we kind of move away from stories, and we move away a little bit from the peculiarities of language in a sense. And I wonder if bringing Freud back into this conversation, if you could talk about how you think Freud and then Lacan might be able to help us bring back this, this is not to denigrate data. I think data is important, but data has become this, in the same way, it's like as if it's transparent, right? Mm-hmm. That it's just fact. And it seems to pitch itself against story, imagination, and really the freedom you're talking about to move beyond, right, the strictures of a sort of determinism. So could you talk a little bit about how you might see, I mean, I know you think a lot about this, about how language and narrative can, with Freud, push back maybe against our cultural inclination at the moment to, have a lot of faith in data.
Thank you for that. It's a great question, and and it's a complex answer in that I think for example, with the pandemic, the emphasis on data has just been paramount and crucial in terms of determining sort of effectiveness around vaccine treatments, about determining behaviors that may be that can reduce transmission and so on. So there are clearly there is a profound need for data and reliable data, and I, in terms of my work at Psychology Today, is very much sort of assessing data for its validity. There are, exactly as you said, there's a sort of presumption that it is a transparent set of facts as opposed to something participating in a larger narrative. And I think the larger narrative is the issue that has been degraded or downgraded by this sort of maybe slightly over-obsessive preoccupation with data, or data holding the keys and the answer, in that, as you're saying, it leads to a very impoverished understanding of human behavior, interaction, as sort of, this is one of the threads of the papers, the sort of the degrading of consciousness has real life implications for policy and for interpersonal relations, in that it very much presents us as sort of in the service of data, but at the mercy of it as well, rather than being able to have a much more expansive focus on the kinds of narratives that are workable and that are at the same time transformative personally and culturally. I'm very much interested in that as well. So I think narrative can be, after all, it is the talking cure, famously. It's not that talking for its own sake is a cure, but a very specific kind of return speech can heighten consciousness, self-awareness in terms of habits that are destructive or that need another set of eyes, a different perspective that can be opened up. And I teach Lacan's very short radio presentation on Lewis Carroll, which is full of issues and problems. And one of the things he said that's so striking, one never passes through a door one's own size. Oh, excuse me, one only ever blew it. One only ever passes through a door one's own size. And it's obviously in reference to Alice's sort of issues to do with physical perspective being the wrong size for that particular door, needing the various aids in order to adjust and so on. But there's something very profound in that statement, which is that one only perceives a door is there when one is psychically ready to pass through it. And I think that kind of understanding really is missing from neuroscience. So the singularity is what troubles them, in the sense that one can't write a kind of generic rule about it. But part of the whole allegory of the red line, if you like, in my talk, is that it really is sort of up to us in terms of where we exit, or also like why we're taking the route in the first place, and what we're going to. But so one only ever passes through a door one's own size is very much tied to that world-shifting consequence of the singularity of perspective that is ready for what is on the other side of it when one walks through it. And that is something intangible in terms of psychotherapy, psychoanalysis, that I think resonates so strongly with people, because it really is about the singularity of our own experiences relative to our own sense of a door needing to be passed through, some kind of threshold there that is passable in the first place. So I think that I mean, you could think of it as you know, it could open into mysticism or obscurantism and so on, but I think it is something so tied to our personal experience that I really do think it's invaluable.
So one last quick question, Brooke.
Hey, yeah, okay, I'll try to go quickly. Thanks so much, Chris. Yeah, your talk was fantastic, and I have a lot of thoughts, but I'm going to try to do a clear question. So I think, yeah, basically, I think I want to ask, how do we think sex or sexuality beyond causality? Because I feel like part of your talk was talking about how genetic scientists or neuroscience want to push us into this framework of cause and effect. And I think Freud and Lacan, they give us models to think of sex beyond that. But yeah, I think, yeah, so trying to think about sex, sexuality beyond causality, while also being trying to maintain the enigma of sexuality through language. So I know it's a big question, but yeah, if you had some thoughts on that.
It's a big one. Lots to say, but I hear myself, I hear Davidson from the talk sort of talking about the deprioritization of instinct as having major consequences for how we think about sexual activity in the first place. That there is a non-inevitable relationship to genital stimulation, which is, he says, like the logical, philosophical, conceptual consequence of thinking of the drive as having multiple sources and influences, that it really does ask us to rethink sex or could do, if we were willing to, in the broadest possible sense, in terms of activity, that really it would, in a much more Deleuzian sense, maybe open the body to stimulation in every sense, that it wouldn't be restricted or limited. So I think, I mean, that essay is really quite interested in what happens if one takes that path. And so he's quite explicit about this, that it deprivileges heterosexuality, and particularly reproduction, in the sense that it is a delinking or a decoupling, perhaps literally. In terms of it is nonetheless a determinant. It is understood as a kind of residual cultural determinant whose logic extends far into the 19th century, with the logic of separate spheres for men and women and so on. And so that kind of legacy, frankly, it has been upended, thank God, and completely rethought. But it remains a structuring principle for so many societies. I think one can't be voluntaristic about that, but what it means is that endlessly the binary is complicated, or the binary presented is understood as insufficient, and for many people just completely unworkable. And so that the logical consequence of expanding that sense of stimulation and freedom is that the binary structure of gender itself just hopefully one day completely unravels. I think it's already happening, but it is, you can see rearguard efforts in many societies around the world to kind of shore it back up again. So I think it can be part of the effort to rethink it. But they are nonetheless social categories, and they have a historical legacy that we have to think about, even if we don't accept as workable for us.
Thank you, Chris. And Els, would you like to finish up? You're not on.
You're muted, yeah.
All right. I already enthusiastically started talking. I just want to thank you, Professor Lane, for your wonderful talk, and thank you, audience members, for your questions. I feel like we've a breakout group altogether.
Thank you for the great questions too. They were amazing. It really set me thinking, and there's lots of thought yet to do. So I appreciate the feedback immensely. Thank you.
Hey, Chris.
Yeah.
I had a tiny question, but it has to do with the history of this. When certain kinds of explanations come in, seems really interesting to me. Mm-hmm. So when evolution comes in, evolution is a teleological narrative. It's always the narrative that explains how we got where we are. Yeah. It's not fact.